I didn't have the feeling that I've done anything wrong. I mean, I didn't have a weapon, I didn't shoot anybody, I didn't kill anybody, I didn't even talk, I didn't do anything to one Jew. All of a sudden you tell us, you're the worst person living on earth.
They probably should know that we are not all Nazis. If you live under the dictatorship, what can you do? What can you say? Nothing.
It didn't take long for me to realize that not all Germans were monsters. Not all Germans were Nazis. And not all Nazis were monsters.
When Hitler came, I was 5, so spent from 5 to 17, I was living in Germany, yes, and it was normal to have there's a Nazi party, and there is Hitler, do you see Heil Hitler, and that was it.
Always people say, why didn't you do anything against it? But you don't live under the dictatorship. When you open your mouth, you just get in a concentration camp. There was spice in a train or so when a soldier came home and said, oh, I think we lost the war. Concentration camp. I never voted for Hitler. I mean, my mother maybe, she was not interested. She had 3 kids to support herself because my father was in the Netherlands, you know.
They lost the cities of Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Stuttgart, Dresden, Berlin. They were bombed to smithereens.
They bombarded us for 7 days, day and night. Not just the airplane, no. With munition, they bombarded us for 7 days and you couldn't sleep, we had nothing to eat. And I really have to say that how much can a human being go through? It was in a May, a beautiful day. My mother was cooking and my girlfriend, she lived on the side. And she said, she called me and said, you know, there is, we had this siren going on when an attack came. She said, we have a little time, why don't you come in our cellar? We always had to go to the cellar, you know. I said, yes, I will try to, very much. So my mother made something to eat and we got our luggage, you know, 3 times a day, the luggage downstairs. And I said, you know, it was already, they start bombing already. You know, when you looked up, you knew where the bombs fell, you know, we knew they're going too fast or so. And I thought, I better go in my cellar, although I wanted to go in their cellar. And the last minute, I changed my mind. And there it was, a big mine went to the side of our house. A mine is a big bomb. We knew it was next to us. And all these people dead. They were sitting there. You know, when a bomb comes and goes in the cellar, your lung explodes, you know. They look like they are alive, but they are dead because your lung is exploding. So my intuition told me not to go there, the last minute, because I said, okay, we have lots to talk about it. I didn't go, and I wouldn't be alive.
Wie schwer auch die Krise im Augenblick sein mag, sie wird durch unseren unabänderlichen Willen, durch unsere Opferbereitschaft und durch unsere Fähigkeiten am Ende trotz alledem gemeistert werden.
In March, April, it was very clear that the war was ending, and the saying was, enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible. And because we knew that the Soviets were coming and not the Americans, although we heard the American cannons, American fire, to the west of Berlin, but the Americans stayed there and they didn't come nearer because they had to wait for the Soviets to go into Berlin because they were allowed to take Berlin.
We prayed that the end will come. But where I lived, half an hour from my house, there was the bunker from Hitler. Also half an hour by car. And he wanted to just have a couple hours more. So he took all these young people, 15 years, and had them fight against the Russian. The Russian was in Berlin already and had them fight. Until then he took his poison. He was afraid that they take him, you know. But so many young people had to die before this son of a gun got killed.
We are interrupting our programs to bring you a news flash.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
When the Russians finished taking over Berlin and had complete control of the city, Stalin rewarded his army by giving them 3 days in which they could do anything they wanted. They could loot, plunder, rape, murder, do anything they wanted without any repercussions. This was get-even time for Stalin for Hitler's betrayal.
They had free reins for 9 weeks because they didn't care about the 3-day thing. They had officially 3 days of loot, rape, kill, whatever. But they didn't stop after the 3 days because they got used to it and they just did whatever they wanted to.
The city was nothing but mayhem. And the people, by that time, the German people were really demoralized, depressed, and defeated. They really were probably at the lowest ebb when that 3 days ended.
These Russians were Mongols. They were in prison in Russia. They opened up the prisons and let these Mongols go first to Berlin and let them have freedom.
The Russians were pretty well controlled by themselves. You had to be careful when they get drunk. They love to drink. And when they drink, you better be careful.
There was some kind of storage we didn't know about. There was a storage by the SS, and they had 10,000 bottles of cognac from France. And the Soviet soldiers found this storage thing, and so they had these 10,000 bottles of cognac. So they were all drunk like hell. Well, I'd say my mother was raped twice. I was taken prisoner by the KGB, or at that time it was the MWD called, my father too. And we were taken prisoners, and because in our house lived a member of the SS security service, and he left before the Russians came, and he was and the KGB people thought we knew where this man is.
I tell you, when the Russian came, first my friend from the other street, she came to our house and said, the Russian coming and they rape everybody. So we were scared. And she said, why don't you make my mother was a seamstress, why don't you make an American flag and put it on your chest and say you're an American? So she got on her machine and made an American flag. And I had some English books. And soon as she did that, there was a knock at the door and there were 2 Russians.
So they held us prisoner together with other people, and interrogated us, and, well, it wasn't so pleasant. I said to my father, well, if you do not tell us where this man we're looking for is, we shoot your son in front of you. And they told me, if you don't tell me where this man is, we shoot your father in front of you. Since we didn't know where he was, we were sort of helpless there. So we had a few things which were not too pleasant.
And they said, we want to come in if you have any bicycle, and we want to talk to you. So I was in a room with him, and I said, you can't touch me, I'm an American. But they heard that song before, you know, and they knew we just want to protect ourselves. So they listened to that and they laughed. And then in the evening, they came back with the captain and wanted to take me. And I was so lucky at that moment. I went to a pantry in a kitchen and I hid myself. And he came with a lamp and he didn't look in the corner. And he didn't see me, and that saved my life, because then they went downstairs and took the other lady. And they raped her. My girlfriend was raped 80 and 100 times. She was 20. Her father shot her to death because she went insane. It was so that these girls didn't know that they had got syphilis from the Russian. But when they felt, but there was no doctors. Everything was in ruin. They didn't know what to do. Until then, you know, even the hospital was so far away, there was no buses, nothing went anymore. No cars, no nothing. And some of them, I know from one girl, she had syphilis and she died later on. Yeah, they all had syphilis, mostly.
There was something which I do not like to remember too well. They took the wounded soldiers out of the school and laid them in a row. And there was next to it, there was a fence, and they tied the nurses to the fence. And then they had the tank roll over the soldiers, wounded soldiers lying down, and then they cut down the fence and raped the nurses. And I happened to be on a street next to it, not knowing what was going on, and the soldiers took me and another man and told us to clean up the chains of the tank from the remains of these soldiers. And afterwards they gave us potatoes. You can have a few potatoes.
We were happy it was over. The Nazis were gone. They left for Argentinian and all over. And it was terrific, you know, how we breathe again, freedom. And we had hope. We wanted to build. We had this, you know, we wanted so much to build up Berlin, because Berlin was such a beautiful, lively city. It was more than Paris before the war.
I think one of the things that impressed me most was the way the German people responded to their situation. They said they were cold, they were hungry, there weren't any jobs. Life was bleak, life was grim. They had been through so much. And yet, they didn't find it difficult to smile and laugh.
To be in the American sector, we were first class. So our sector, we were happy. Oh, the other American sector, we had the best. The second best was the British sector. The British cigarettes were not worth as much as American cigarettes, but it was still good currency. And they were a bit, you know, up your nose, and well, the British, they were not that nice, but it was okay. The third class was the French. French, very arrogant, very harsh, sometimes a bit cruel, and very strict against the Germans. Of course, the worst was the Russian sector. This was class 4. If you were in the Russian sectors, you said, oh, the poor guys in the Russian sector. Of course, you couldn't mingle. There was no Berlin Wall yet. So it was one city, but you were living in a certain class.
When they left Berlin, they took everything. They took just everything. From the houses, inside, the toilet and everything. When the Russian came in, they never saw a toilet. And they put their butter inside of the toilet, and then they slipped it, and the butter was gone. And then they didn't know where it went. There you can see how poor Russia is. No toilet, no warm water. They couldn't believe it. No bicycle. They wanted all the bicycles. And I had a new bicycle they took. Yeah, Russia must be very, very poor. The first year was hard, you know. We had to build up our city. And I must say they built it up very fast.
The women did it. The women cleaned up Berlin. We had the Trümmerfrauen, the Rubble women, the Rubble wives, the Rubble women. There were just women left, old men, young boys, and women, because the men went into the war and they were not there. So the main population was women anyway.
Cleanup of Berlin was one of the priorities, especially when we did get Mayor Ernst Reuter. You know, he really got that thing going of the cleanup of the city. And so since every building in Berlin was probably built out of brick, there were no wooden structures. Everything was, bricks were at a premium.
And the women started to clean up. They went through the rubble, cleaned the bricks with a little hammer, cleaned each brick and piled up the bricks, and cleaned up the street, and you could walk through the street again.
What do you do with all the broken bricks and the leftover mortar and all that stuff? Well, there was no place to put it. So a decision was made there was an area in Schöneberg to carry all that rubble over there, pile it up as a big mountain, which the Berliners called Mount Klamotte. Klamotte is just a stone, you know, and they built a beautiful park over it.
That gave us hope, and that gave us the incentive to do things.
Slowly, very slowly, got everything, you know, the buses were running again, and the U-Bahn and transportation was fantastic. And to this day, the transportation is better than in ganz America.
When the war ended in Berlin, commerce was practically non-existent. The only game in town was black market. And it started almost immediately. In the first months before the Americans were allowed into Berlin, the first 2 months when the Russians were there alone, they had plenty of money to spend. Now what had happened was the occupation marks were printed for the conquerors to use. Now the occupation marks for the British and the French and the Americans were printed in Washington, and a very strict count was kept of them so that eventually France and England could reimburse the United States for the money which the United States was backing. But with the Russians, what we did was just give them a set of the plates. the Russians printed their own money, and they started those printing presses rolling, and they kept them rolling. Now, the United States was backing that money, and the Russians used it to pay off their army. Now, some of their army hadn't been paid in 3 years, so you can imagine the billions upon billions upon billions of rubles that were owed to the Russian army. So, in effect, the United States taxpayer paid off the Russian army at the end of World War II. Now, the Russians had all this money, and they had to spend it because the occupation marks could not be converted into rubles. So they had to spend them before they left Berlin, before they left Germany. So they were rolling in money. And a lot of Germans had money too, because goods had been so scarce during the war that many of them had saved a lot of money. There was plenty of money, but very few goods to purchase with the money, and that's why there was this enormous inflation. Now, when the Americans came in, and the British and the French, it was a little different. They could convert their money back into their own currency, so that an American soldier could sell goods on the black market, like his cigarettes, and then he could take those marks and he could take them to the Army Post Office, and he could buy money orders at the official rate of 10 marks to the dollar, whereas the unofficial rate was 100 marks to the dollar. So when an American soldier sold a carton of cigarettes, which cost him 50 cents, he could sell those cigarettes for 1,000 marks or $100, or sometimes even 1,500 marks for $150.
The black market was in the hands of displaced person, DPs. When they were opened up, their inmate uniforms, I think, were exchanged for American soldiers' uniforms, which were all dyed black, so they all looked the same, and they were easily recognizable, especially with the big army field coat, which was an unusual sight in those days. And they were just on every street corner or wherever you can look at them, because German police didn't exist in those days. American military police wasn't allowed to touch them, and so they were just there. They controlled themselves, more or less.
Of course, there was a big black market on the Potsdamer Platz. The Potsdamer Platz, right in the middle of the city, where the Russian and the American sectors met, and there was the black market. And so whatever you had, you went there hoping that somebody would come and snatch it up, especially some American GI who had a carton of cigarettes under his arm and said, well, let's see, what do you got? Diamonds, what do you got?
If you needed something special, if you wanted to make some money exchange or buy some jewelry, buy some gold and so forth, or whatever, you just would walk up to them, and if that particular one couldn't help you, he would tell you to come back tomorrow or the next day and have somebody there who could help you. So it was one of the easiest things to do.
Really, whatever you had, you just tried to trade it for cigarettes, or if you had somebody who knew how to get things like butter. No butter, fat, anything what we needed, because on the ration alone you could hardly survive, so you had to find a way of getting anything extra. Fruit or vegetables or butter or the currency, of course, was cigarettes, because if you always counted in American cigarettes, how many American cigarettes is this, how many American cigarettes is that?
A pack of cigarettes, I don't know what you could buy for, For instance, one of the corner buildings on Kurfürstendamm, a big house, which of course lay in ruins, and since the American, or let's say the Allied propaganda was that in those days, that we will never allow Germany to rebuild, this property, corner property, sold for 52 cartons of cigarettes. It was a big thing, was all over the underground papers and so forth in Berlin. in those days.
What you were sure to get rid of was real crystal. The GIs just loved anything, you know, vases, bowls, ashtrays, glasses, and they always looked at, is it real crystal? Yeah, this is real crystal. So it's on the back. Underneath, yes, real crystal. It says real. Oh, real crystal. Okay. Here are so many cigarettes, and so it went. So, but it was not the only black market. Of course, wherever you went, you had and you found some American, and then you sort of said, well, can we make a deal somehow with what? And they were asking, what do you got? It was bartering. I didn't have a talent for it. Of course, the nylon stocking was another currency. But this is, if we go into the Fräulein thing there, I mean, if the Fräuleins and the nylon stockings thing that went together. There was another, but that's another market I was not in. Well, we were used to food and rationing during the war because the minute the war began, we had food rationing. And it got less and less, and in the end, we just didn't have anything worth mentioning on our food stamp rationing card. And having a food ration card didn't mean that we would get the food. So the food rationing was something, a big problem. There were many people starving to death, of course, and if they froze to death or they starved to death or whatever, so it was a problem, and you had to look for food.
The winter of 1946 were very hard, and we had no coal, and we had, for a couple hours, we had no light either. So we were sitting there freezing and burned everything we could find, wood and so on and so forth. It was very hard, and of course, we had still ration cards, but we felt more free through the American occupation. And we finally got rid of the Nazis, and we were very lucky that was all over. It was just too much.
The shortness of food for the Germans was brought to my attention shortly after I got there, and we were living temporarily with a friend who had already been given a house, and we had not yet gotten a house to live in. And the housekeeper, Anita, there one day said to me, we had grapefruit. There was some fresh grapefruit from the commissary. And Anita, the housekeeper, asked me if she could take the grapefruit rind home for her little 2-year-old so he would get some vitamin C. Now, again, I hadn't realized exactly how stark the diet was for Germans. So then after that, of course, I would buy things for her little 2-year-old in the commissary, which fruit juices and fruits and vegetables and things that they were not getting on the German market at all.
Oh, we didn't get too much. We had maybe 3 pieces or 4 pieces of bread every day when you know, and then 10 grams of fat and a little bit sugar. We were really starving. We ate water soups, you know, with carrot soup, with carrots. Some girls survived because they sold themselves for food or for any other things, for money, because it was still very hard to get any decent food.
There was, in the very beginning, when I first got to Berlin, there was very, very, very little food. We, for instance, one of the favorite dish was we would make some, what we called Brotaufstrich, something you put on your bread, we would make it out of green apples, some majoram, which is a spice, some flour, if you had it, and some water, and it tasted delicious. It's what you make it, especially if you toast the bread a little bit.
I went up to Germany with my mother was a seamstress, so she made a couple dresses, and I went up to the country to exchange dresses for butter or for tea or something, eggs. And then when I came back, the police or guards, German guards, they took everything from us. And then the train didn't come, and we had to sleep on a floor, I mean on a street. And I get lice. And when I came home, I was very, very down.
Well, the food situation was very severe, and so what you had to do, you had to climb on a train and get out into the country and try to go to a farmer and ask for food. And so you carried your oriental rug with you, or you carried anything worth for trading. That's what you called, you went hamstern. To go hamster, the hamster who takes all in his pocket, you know. So you went on a freight train, slow freight train, jumped on the slow freight train, out into the country to any farmer, and he said, well, what do you got? What do you got? Okay. They had it. They had a wonderful life, if they had anything worth giving away in the way of food. And so you came back with a knapsack full of whatever you had, hamstered. You were hamstering and went back to the city, and you had some food there.
One of the best dinner parties that I ever attended in my whole life happened in the fall of 1947. Now, Berlin was dark, it was cold, the people were hungry, and some German friends whom we had met a few months before, that was Klaus and Renate Schulman. They were probably in their mid-30s, and they were actors, out-of-work actors at that time, like just about everybody in Germany was. And they were quite poor at the time. But one evening, they invited us to come to their home, and they lived in the British sector of Berlin. So we thought a little bit about, what the evening might be like and what we should bring for a hostess gift, and we decided on cigarettes, coffee, and some brandy. Because cigarettes were the most desirable medium of exchange in Berlin at the time, and even if they didn't smoke them, they could certainly exchange them for other goods. Coffee, because Germans loved coffee, and they only had fake coffee at that time, and brandy, because that would make the coffee better. So when we got to their apartment, which we had never been to before, we were surprised to find that it was in a partly bombed out building right off the Kudamm. And their apartment was small and in pretty bad condition at that time. When we got there, they had other people there already, and there was a table set up, a dining table set up, and I thought that was strange because people didn't have any food in Germany at the time, and this was about 8 o'clock in the evening. But we were invited everybody to sit around the dining room table. So we did, and found that what we were going to have was a pretend dinner party. The table had been set very nicely. Different people had brought some of their best china and glassware and tableware, so it looked very pretty. And in the middle of the table was a little vase of flowers. Now in Berlin, I had found out over the months there that even though the people had little food, not enough food, and had very little money, they always found a few pfennig to buy some flowers with, and they almost always had a few fresh flowers in the house. So there were flowers in the middle of the table. And the first course to be served was going to be an appetizer. So what we did was go around the table, and each person chose their favorite appetizer they remembered from years past, and talk about it and describe it and tell about where had they eaten it and how was it fixed and the ingredients and all of this. So we went around the table and everybody did that. Then the next course was soup, and everyone chose their favorite soup and talked about it. Then came the main entree, and there somebody chose a Christmas goose with red cabbage, somebody chose schnitzel, somebody chose Hasenpfeffer, a rabbit dish, and somebody chose Königsberger Klops. So then after that, of course, there was the dessert course, and there everybody really went wild about choosing their favorite desserts. And by the time that was finished, now the dinner was in candlelight because they didn't have electrical power at the time. But by the time dinner was over, the electricity came on, and that was just perfect timing because then Renata was able to make coffee with the coffee that we had brought. And so everyone had coffee and brandy and smoked cigarettes for the rest of the evening.
It was very strange because it was like coming into another world, coming into the world of normalcy, coming into a world where, like, there wasn't a war, there was no after war, that nothing after that, just like everything was normal. That there was no politics, that there was nobody starving to death or whatever. That there was just normal people getting together.
And now these were hungry people, these were cold people, these were poor people. And yet we had a wonderful evening and had a lot of laughs and just a wonderful time, and everybody went away with a very positive feeling about having spent a great evening. So this was a dinner party where there was no dinner served, and it was one of the best dinner parties I ever attended in my whole life.
Of course, we had this feeling that we were left out for 15 years out of everything, that there was a gap, cultural gap. And the people who were older, they remembered the times, it was the famous 20s in Berlin. And so we tried to catch up on it, but we didn't have any material. The hard thing to do was to get the material.
When the war ended in Berlin, the entertainment industry was, along with everything else, was pretty well demolished. There was nothing much left. Now, in order for anyone to start anything in either newspaper business, in book publishing, in magazines, in filmmaking, in radio, in stage, in opera, whatever the project was, it had to be approved by the military government. They just couldn't start doing it because everything, I mean, the Germans were completely at the mercy of the conquerors. So in the film industry, that office too came under Berlin sector at the time. And the head of it, of the film industry in Berlin, the czar of movies in Berlin at the time, was Erich Palmer. He had been a very prominent and important producer in pre-war Berlin. He went to Hollywood during the Hitler times and had become very successful there, and came back to Germany as a colonel in the army and became the head of the film industry in Berlin. And it was up to him who got started in the business and what films they were allowed to produce. Now that was true of newspapers too. Everything had to be approved by the Berlin Kommandantur. The Germans could do nothing on their own. But despite the destruction that the industries had suffered, and despite the fact that they had to get approval to start projects and carry them through, still the arts started immediately again in Berlin, because for one thing, so many of the people who had left the country came back now. That is, from Hollywood, from New York, from France, from other places. The people who had been big in the industries, many of them were returning to Germany and were, again, beginning projects. For instance, directors like William Wyler came back, Billy Wilder. Many of them came back and made films, produced movies, produced stage plays. So it wasn't long. I think the arts are always very hard to kill off, because this is not a physical entity. This is mainly a mental exercise. This is a mental entrepreneurship that doesn't need the things like a ball-bearing factory would need. So you need the ideas, and so the people with the ideas came back, and the people with ideas who had been not allowed to flourish during the Hitler times now were allowed to do that. And so it was not long at all before the arts again became an important part of life in Berlin and in Germany.
Uh, we were frantic to get American plays, Tennessee Williams and things like that. And we were frantic to get books, and so we went to wherever. Do you still have books from the old days before? And he said, yes, I hid them, and now it came. So it came to the surface. It was a strange mixture of very old culture of the days gone by in the 20s or whatever, or the new things coming from America, or mostly America, because France, they were very, they kept to themselves, and from France we did not get anything. But the American says, yes, here it is, and with the music and the theater and the movies, which was American movies, my God, we lapped it up like anything. So that was, and of course the German art, it was a void. We didn't have anything, so it took time. It took a long time to develop what you call German art, because modern art, we didn't know anything about it. So we had to learn.
The real art lovers were actually the Russians. And if you wanted to go see good theater or anything like that, you would actually go into the Russian zone, which was nothing, you know. You step in the U-Bahn, you go over there, and that's it. That's even Sonja Ziemann. He worked for a long time at the Metropole Theater, which was located in the Russian zone.
There's one thing that is similar from Nazi and Bolshevism, communism. They know the importance of movies. They know the importance that you can influence people by making movies. So the last thing that was still working in Berlin was the film industry. And we were making comedy films. I was assistant director with, yes, because I was assistant director with 17, because there was no men who would usually do the job. They were always soldiers, and they were not there. But I, being not, I was sort of, what is it called, 4F? So they didn't take me as a soldier, so I was there, and I worked there in the UFA Babelsberg, which was the motion city near Berlin, and I worked there as an assistant director, and we're doing a silly, light-hearted comedy in 44 up to 45, and so this was the last thing that would still work. So after the war, when the Russians came, they set up the movie industry again. And so in 46, yes, early 46, they were again doing movies, that is German movies, and the first movie that was done after the war, I was there as an assistant director, and we've made a movie about the children in the rubbles of Berlin, playing in the rubbles, being without any future, any hope, but somehow we regain our strengths and we clean up, again, the cleanup thing. So we had this movie, and it was by the Russians. They even gave us 1 egg a week extra. Yes, because we were intelligentsia. That's what they called us, intelligentsia. We are the intelligent people, not artists, but intelligents. And so they gave us 1 egg extra a week.
In the western part, the revival would take a little bit longer, you know, because the West already was more cost conscious, and it was more bombed out, you know, and so forth. So it was a little bit harder, but it was there. You know, efforts were made.
In the western sectors, there was a certain man called Arthur Browner, and he was a displaced person. He was, and he had the audacity to, I'll make a movie here in the western sector. And he founded the CCC, the cinema company, Central Cinema Company, CCC. And so the second movie was a light-hearted comedy again, called Herzkönig, the King of Hearts. And me again was assistant director there. And this is where we didn't have anything to go on. We had to shoot during the night because there was only electricity at certain hours during the night. And sometimes we were working, and we didn't tell the artists that we didn't have any material, because Arthur Browner bought the film material, the negative film material, on the black market. Cigarettes, you know, everything, anything, coal for heating, and cigarettes and other things, buying this. Sometimes some didn't work out, so we didn't have the film material, but we didn't tell the others, so we were shooting, you know, we were shooting without material. So it was rather interesting. And by the way, this is when I met Jim and Angela, because they were friends with Arthur Browner, and they came watching us doing this movie. And this is something that seems to be the last to go and the first to come to do some silly movies. I was an MC for the special service touring American clubs with a band and 4 singers in the American sector, in American zone. And we knew something would happen. It was in the air that something would happen. We'd better go back to Berlin. So we went back to Berlin, and we just came into Berlin a short time before the blockade started. And so when the blockade was in effect, of course, we didn't know what was happening. Would the Americans leave? Would the French leave? Would the British leave? Would they keep their sectors? Would they keep their sectors, or would they say, well, okay, we get out of here because we've had it, and let the Russians have this Berlin? What do we care?
When the blockade happened, I think the most memorable thing was that electricity was limited to 2 hours a day. And it was not always at a time when it was most useful, you know. Sometimes, you know, your electricity came on from 2 to 4 in the morning. So you had to do your ironing and or listening to the radio at that time.
The Russians blocked every freeway to Berlin. They blocked it. And they wanted that the German people starve to death. And the Americans wouldn't allow it. So they flew so many times, every day for 8 or 9 months, the food into Germany. And we, of course, we loved it, you know. We were so happy. But the Russians are very cruel. I tell you, to starve the whole city. I can't, when I think about, when you're young, you take everything day in, day out, they're bad news, and you always have a future, you think, But when you think back, it's fantastic how we survive everything and how the American did save our life.
And they cared. And they stayed there, and we sort of, they stand by their word. They stand up against the Russians. Now this made us very proud, very happy, and it gave us a feeling of being secure and of being in the same boat. Of course, it was hard. The food was scarce again, more than before. We didn't know what would come in. We had to close down all the cinemas. We had to close down the legitimate theater. We had to shut down anything. With no cinemas, the theaters closed, the cabarets closed. There was nothing going on that would cost electricity. There was nothing going on that caused any extra energy. We sort of were living on a low level. But we were living, and we were thinking, and it was sort of interesting in a way. What's going to happen? Will there be, how far will it go, this antagonism between capitalism and communism? Will the Americans and the Russians, will there be a war? Will there be a fight? Or will we be crushed between them? So we were watching from day to day what would happen, and then this airlift started, and this gave us this wonderful feeling of, yes, the friendship, which was unofficial before, friendship in a way, this being not the bad enemy, the low-down Nazi, and we, the American victors. No, but this of having some way of communicating, not just the Fräuleins, but that's in a way we were both chewing gum. We were both having some kind of communication. That this was, which was acknowledged unofficially, was now official. We, yes, are in a way not chums, but anyway, we're just friends. The difference between my generation and the children of today is huge. It is just, if I tell these stories, if I tell them to you, you might have not known what it was like, but it is not known to the children in Berlin today. Even if you tell it to someone now, a teenager in Berlin, they go, because they're interested in disco, they're interested in hip hop, in rap, in the clothes you wear, and you have to have the newest Nike shoes, and they're not interested in history, and they're not interested to hear these stories, and they wouldn't know anything about it. They cannot imagine what it was like. So it is almost like, or as it is in America. If you tell it to someone in America, they say, "Well, I don't relate to this. What is it all about?" There is a gap. There's a gap between us, if I may call it us, and the younger generation. And it is very hard to convey the feelings, the way we lived, the lifestyle, the problems we had to anybody younger, who is in the 20s or even 30s. It's not possible. It is in a strange way that the 9/11, for instance, is something which I can relate to probably much more than any young American could. Was I said, yes, I know what it was like. I know what it was like when they bombed the house. You know what it was like when the house came together and the people burned and jumped to death, or what it was like because we've had it off and on, and I ran through burning streets and stumbled over burned corpses, and I had trouble getting out of Rubbles when our house collapsed, and so this is something which is so new to the younger Americans. No, I think to all Americans, because it never happened in your country. It is, for us, it's unbelievable that you say, oh, somebody bombed a house in America. It never happened before. That is, to us, especially in Berlin, so unbelievable. Isn't that normal? It used to be during the war, that the war never came to America. It's something you have to think of it. Wow, there wasn't anything going on in America. So now telling about this time when we had the air raids and all this, maybe if we tell you, what it was 9/11, no, the Americans was no, it couldn't be. The 9/11 is so unique because it's unique to America. And if we say, well, it was not very unique to us, then it's hard. I hesitate to mention this because it takes off from the terror and the horror of the American thing. You cannot compare it. Yes, you cannot compare it. Of course, it's awful, but I know it. It happened. It happened to have over again at that time. So if we want to tell about that, maybe we can say, yes, by the way, if you think of 9/11, this is what we had for 5 years. We had the 9/11s every week or every 2 days.